They never complained. They simply figured it out. That was the unwritten rule. Something happened to children raised in that decade that the modern world still hasn't understood. They became quieter, steadier, and profoundly harder to break than anyone around them. This is not nostalgia, this is psychology, and it explains everything about who they became. If you grew up in the 1970s, or love someone who did, this will finally give language to something you have always quietly sensed. Something real. Something psychological. Something worth understanding deeply. Most people assume the 1970s were simple, calm, and easy for children growing up inside them. That assumption is not just wrong, it is precisely, completely backwards in almost every important way imaginable. The 1970s were economically brutal. Inflation gutted household budgets, crime rates climbed dangerously, political scandals destroyed public trust. Parents were not designing enriching childhoods, they were simply surviving each week with whatever strength remained available. These children were never protected from difficulty. They were placed directly inside it and quietly expected to navigate it alone, without complaint, without help, and without anyone particularly noticing whether they were struggling or not. So the simplicity people romanticize about that decade was not ease. It was scarcity dressed in warm nostalgia. What looked like freedom from outside was actually the accidental birthplace of extraordinary and deeply underappreciated psychological resilience. Picture a child, 9 years old, leaving home Saturday morning with only a bicycle and one instruction: be home before the streetlights come on. No phone, no GPS, no way for anyone to monitor, intervene, or check in whatsoever. That child rides for miles, gets completely lost, encounters strangers, resolves a conflict with neighborhood kids, and finds their way home dusty and tired. They arrive more complete as a human being than when they left hours earlier. That experience repeated itself across millions of childhoods throughout that entire decade. It was not reckless parenting. It was the accidental, extraordinarily effective architecture of a deeply capable adult being quietly constructed one ordinary afternoon at a time. The freedom was real. The consequences were real. And the lessons that arrived through those consequences about judgment, about risk, about recovery, were more durable than anything a classroom could have delivered deliberately. Psychologists studying developmental resilience identify a concept called autonomous stress exposure, encountering manageable difficulty without immediate adult rescue. Children who experience this consistently build a stronger internal locus of control, believing their actions genuinely shape their outcomes. Children of the 1970s lived almost entirely inside this framework without anyone planning it. Their parents, busy surviving real pressures, were inadvertently giving them one of the most powerful developmental gifts psychological research has ever identified and documented. The brain, repeatedly asked to solve its own problems without external scaffolding, gradually rewires itself to default toward resourcefulness rather than helplessness. That invisible rewiring happened slowly across hundreds of ordinary afternoons and became the foundation of an entire generation's quiet, unshakable strength. The practical skills that emerged were specific and deeply embodied. A child fixing a broken bicycle chain with no tutorial and no adult nearby was developing what neuroscientists now call procedural confidence, the encoded knowledge that you can figure things out under genuine pressure. These children learned to cook basic meals, navigate fierce peer conflicts without adult mediation, and tolerate physical discomfort without catastrophizing. Nobody planned to teach them these things. They arrived through friction, failure, and the quiet, relentless pressure of necessity pressing against a developing mind. There was no child-optimized schedule in a typical 1970s home. Children were woven into adult life and expected to observe, absorb, and keep pace. They watched parents manage finances under strain, disagree and recover, and make hard decisions without extended deliberation or emotional ceremony. By absorbing these scenes daily across years of development, they were building vicarious competence, unconsciously learning adult problem-solving strategies through sustained observation of real adults handling real pressure. No structured lesson could replicate what those kitchen table moments quietly delivered every single evening. A child watching a parent repair something broken with available materials absorbs a template for resourcefulness. A child observing a parent hold composure under provocation absorbs a model of emotional regulation worth more than any formally taught self-management technique or mindfulness practice available today. Boredom in the 1970s was not treated as a problem requiring parental solution. It was simply a condition children were left inside until they generated their own exit through internal resources. That search for stimulation was precisely where creativity was born in those developing minds. Research on creative cognition consistently demonstrates the brain requires sustained periods of low external stimulation to generate truly original thought and make unexpected connections between stored ideas. Modern children rarely experience that quality of stillness before something external fills the space immediately. Children of the 1970s lived inside that mental stillness for hours daily. They built imaginary worlds from nothing. They invented games using whatever objects were nearby. They developed a deep tolerance for quiet that would later serve them in crises, relationships, and long professional challenges requiring sustained internal focus. Risk was never something those children observed safely from a distance. It was something they did on ordinary Tuesday afternoons with no safety net beyond their own accumulating judgment and the hard lessons they had already collected from previous attempts and their real consequences. They climbed trees to heights that would make modern parents anxious. They built unstable ramps and rode bicycles down steep hills specifically to discover what would happen. They tested limits constantly, not from rebellion, but from a primal desire to understand reality through direct physical contact with it. When things went wrong, the consequence was immediate and concrete. A broken bone, a conflict requiring direct resolution without adult mediation. A failed project that had to be abandoned without anyone organizing an emotional response or processing session around the disappointment involved. This tight feedback loop between action, consequence, and recovery created unusually well-calibrated judgment in these children. The specific ability to distinguish genuine risk from imagined risk remains one of the most practically valuable cognitive skills a human being can possess throughout adult life. There were also long afternoons spent in genuine solitude, not the loneliness of exclusion, but the clean solitude of a child alone with their own thoughts, and nothing competing for their attention from any direction or platform or notification requiring immediate response. A child lying in a yard watching clouds shift slowly overhead. A child sitting in a treehouse with no particular purpose. A child rereading the same book twice, because it still had something left to offer. These moments appeared empty, but were neurologically anything but empty. Neuroscience now recognizes the default mode network, the brain's introspective processing system, as essential for developing stable identity, genuine empathy, and emotional clarity. Children of the 1970s were activating this network constantly, building a rich interior world that became their compass through adult life. Without screens available to outsource their inner life to, they were required to develop genuine self-knowledge through sustained internal reflection. That interior world, built across thousands of quiet, unrecorded hours, became the anchor that kept them grounded when adult life pressed hard against them. Emotions in the typical 1970s household were not processed in real time, through guided validation or immediate compassionate reflection. They were held privately, examined internally, and managed through conscious delay that required genuine discipline from children who had no formal language for what they were doing. A child who was furious learned to contain that fury long enough to understand its actual source. A child experiencing sadness did not always receive immediate comfort, because parents were occupied and the culture simply did not operate that way as a standard expectation for anyone. This was not neglect. It was the accidental cultivation of emotional self-regulation which psychological research consistently identifies as among the most powerful predictors of adult success. Relational stability and long-term mental health across every demographic studied extensively over multiple decades of careful follow-up research. Walter Mischel's foundational research on delayed gratification demonstrated clearly that children who tolerate emotional discomfort without requiring immediate resolution consistently outperform those who cannot across virtually. Every measurable life outcome tracked carefully over decades of documented follow-up study and analysis. Waiting was simply the texture of ordinary life in that decade, and nobody considered it remarkable or worth mentioning. You waited for your favorite television program at its specific scheduled time because no other option existed, and the anticipation itself became part of the experience's value. You saved money for weeks to buy something you wanted, holding desire alive through patience rather than collapsing it instantly with an immediate purchase. That sustained wanting taught the mind something extraordinarily valuable about motivation, imagination, and the satisfying weight of things genuinely earned over time. Inside that waiting, the mind learned to project forward into imagined futures without requiring constant reassurance or reward. It learned to sustain motivation across time, to maintain commitment through the long, unremarkable stretches between exciting beginnings and satisfying endings. That is the neurological foundation of genuine long-term thinking. This is precisely why so many people from this generation can work steadily toward distant objectives, without requiring constant external feedback, confirming they are making acceptable progress. That capacity, built quietly through years of ordinary waiting, became an extraordinary and increasingly rare competitive advantage in adult professional life. Failure arrived in those childhoods regularly and entirely without ceremony. A friendship dissolved badly. A plan collapsed completely. A creative project fell apart publicly in front of other children, who noticed and remembered, and the adults around them rarely organized a careful therapeutic response to manage the experience. The child simply picked themselves up, not because no one cared, but because recovery was what people did, and every adult around them demonstrated it continuously as a matter of ordinary course, without drama, without extended processing, and without anyone suggesting the failure was particularly unusual or devastating. Developmental psychologists identify this pattern as post-adversity growth, and they have identified one essential ingredient, the space to fail, without the failure being treated as an emergency. When failure is met with calm expectation of recovery, children internalize at a deep level that failure is temporary, survivable, and ultimately instructive rather than defining. That belief, lodged in the nervous system through repeated real experience, becomes one of the most durable competitive advantages a human being can carry into adult life. It is the difference between someone who collapses under setback and someone who simply, quietly, begins again without requiring permission or encouragement. Reading other people accurately was never a skill these children studied formally. It was a survival tool sharpened daily through dense, constant, unmediated human interaction across every social context they inhabited, without screens filtering or simplifying the complexity of what was actually happening between people. They played in large mixed-age groups, with shifting social hierarchies requiring continuous navigation. They sat at dinner tables where adult conversations carried multiple layers of meaning beneath the actual words spoken aloud. They learned early that tone, silence, timing, and posture all carried precise and actionable information about reality. A child who grows up reading rooms rather than reading screens develops social intelligence that is extraordinarily rare and extraordinarily valuable in every professional and personal context that involves other human beings, which is to say every context that genuinely matters throughout the entire arc of adult life. They became skilled conflict navigators, not through taught frameworks, but through living inside real conflict and finding their own way through it. Without adult mediation, removing the difficulty, that direct experience produced instincts about human behavior that no workshop or training program has ever successfully replicated or replaced. These traits, genuine patience, practical resilience, deep self-reliance, effective emotional regulation, creative problem-solving, and authentic social intelligence built through real human contact, are not charming relics of a simpler historical period that no longer has anything useful to offer the present moment. They are precisely the capacities distinguishing extraordinary leaders, remarkable parents, creative entrepreneurs, and deeply trustworthy partners in the contemporary world. The painful irony is that our current environment, despite possessing more resources and more explicit attention to child development, is systematically failing to produce these capacities anywhere near the rate the 1970s produced them entirely by accident. We have optimized modern childhood aggressively for comfort, safety, and the elimination of friction. In doing so, we have inadvertently stripped childhood of the very difficulty that builds authentic character rather than performed confidence, and the difference between those two things becomes starkly visible. The moment, genuine adversity, arrives and removes all the comfortable scaffolding. Understanding this is not a romantic argument for returning to the past. It is a precise and urgent argument for deliberately reintroducing manageable difficulty, genuine solitude, real autonomy, an honest consequence into the lives of every person we genuinely want to see grow into someone capable of handling what adult life will inevitably demand. Here is what the 1970s ultimately gave the children who grew up inside it: A self that was genuinely built through experience, rather than carefully delivered through curated enrichment programs. Not assembled on praise, but forged through long, unobserved hours, real consequences, genuine solitude, and the relentless daily demand to figure it out. That self is stable in a way externally constructed confidence almost never manages to be, because it was not built on external validation. It does not require external validation to remain intact when pressure arrives, and circumstances stop being comfortable and cooperative and begin demanding something real from the person inside them. The people who carry this silent survival instinct into the modern world are not always the loudest voices or the most polished performers in any room. But when circumstances deteriorate, and circumstances always eventually deteriorate for everyone, they are the ones still standing, still thinking clearly, still moving forward with quiet and unmistakable purpose. Not because nothing touches them, not because they feel no fear or carry no wounds from everything life has pressed against them across the decades, but because they were built, across thousands of ordinary unrecorded afternoons in a turbulent and deeply underestimated decade, to outlast almost anything.